When Ben Shapiro stepped into the studio of The View with Whoopi Goldberg, everyone expected just another debate. But Whoopi had no idea that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. She thought it would be an easy attack, not knowing that she was up against someone immune to pressure. What happened next would redefine everything. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified whenever there are new stories on the channel. Ben Shapiro was sitting in his office in Los Angeles, reviewing notes for his next podcast. With his dark hair neatly combed and his characteristic glasses resting on his nose, he was preparing to address issues of domestic politics and, of course, the so-called woke agenda that bothered him so much. In the middle of the papers, his cell phone vibrated. "Ben, this is Sarah Donovan, senior producer of The View. We'd like to invite you for a live interview on our show. We think it would be an opportunity for you to present your ideas to a different audience." Ben frowned. It was rare for him to be invited to a program like The View, hosted by Whoopi Goldberg, known for a more progressive editorial line. Since his popularity had grown in conservative circles, he had received occasional debate invitations, but always in environments he knew well. The View would be unfriendly territory. "Interesting, Sarah. May I ask what the main agenda is?" asked Ben, opening his notepad. "We want to talk about political polarization in the United States, identity politics, and of course the controversy surrounding USAID, and support for projects that you conservatives have criticized as part of this so-called woke agenda." He adjusted his glasses. "Well, I have plenty to say about that, no doubt." Sarah was quick to point out that the production was planning a polite debate, but everyone knew that The View wasn't usually kind to Republican voices. Ben hesitated for a moment, but his conviction that ideas are tested in confrontation made him accept. The next day, his social networks were already announcing, "Ben Shapiro will be on The View, get ready." The public who followed him faithfully turned up their noses. Many feared that this was just another trap set by the mainstream media. But Ben was confident. The ABC studio in New York was buzzing with technicians running around. Backstage, lights were flashing, microphones were being tested, and a team of makeup artists were adjusting the last details. Whoopi Goldberg, the veteran host, was calmly going through her notes, as she always did. Next to her, Emily Jenkins, also that week's guest presenter, looked at the list of questions, full of handwritten comments in red ink. "Do you really think he's going to answer our questions about gender identity without running away from the subject?" asked Emily, smoothing her scarf around her neck. Whoopi shrugged. "Ben Shapiro doesn't usually shy away. He claims to have facts and statistics for everything. Let's see if the audience agrees with his facts and logic." Ben arrived accompanied by Michael Parker, his press officer. Michael, tall and blonde, always had a worried look on his face. As soon as they entered, they were directed to dressing room 3. "Ben, remember, they're going to try to put pressure on you to show you how conservatism is outdated. But today is your chance to take the discussion beyond the superficial. Focus on what you do best. Rational arguments, real examples," Michael advised. Ben smiled as he checked his watch. "You know I don't shy away from confrontation. If you try to corner me, I'll counter with facts." Shortly afterwards, a production assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Shapiro, we need you on stage in 5 minutes." The tension was palpable in the corridors. Cameras, spotlights, people in the audience waiting for the show to start. The first chords of the opening track of The View began to play. Soon, the camera showed Whoopi Goldberg introducing the day's guests. There was a comedy actor sitting further away, but the main seat was reserved for Ben Shapiro. "Good afternoon, America," Whoopi began in her unmistakable voice. "Today, we have a very special guest, loved by some, questioned by others. Ben Shapiro, political commentator and host of a conservative podcast with a huge audience." Ben entered, to mixed applause, some sincere, some more hesitant. He sat in the center, adjusted his jacket and greeted Whoopi with a polite handshake, the audience murmured. Whoopi began politely. "Ben, thank you for accepting the invitation. I'd first like to talk about why you're here. Identity politics and what you call the woke agenda. Could you explain why you oppose certain programs? Supported by USAID, for example? Ben straightened his posture. Of course, Whoopi. I believe that many USAID-funded initiatives end up prioritizing identity divisions instead of promoting opportunities for all. In some cases, there are programs that target investments only to specific groups, ignoring the reality of other populations equally in need. My point is that policies that separate people by race, sexual orientation, or gender can paradoxically increase social division. Emily Jenkins wasted no time in interrupting. But Ben, isn't it natural to cater to historically oppressed groups? Aren't we finally correcting past injustices? The audience reacted with applause. Ben took a deep breath before replying. I understand the motivation, but programs that are based solely on identity can create resentment and don't solve the root of the problem. Why have these groups been marginalized? I'd rather invest in infrastructure solutions, quality basic education, and access to healthcare for all. This combats inequalities without segregating. A slight buzz ran through the studio. Whoopi realized that Ben was far from intimidated. Who took the floor now was co-host Diane Miller, a woman with a stern expression who always looked at her guests as if she was ready to reprimand them. Ben, you talk a lot about facts and logic, but many people who defend identity politics are also based on data. For example, data on systemic racism and historical disparities. Do you deny that systemic racism exists? Ben shook his head. I don't deny the history of racism in the United States. That would be dishonest. But what I question is the generalization of the term systemic to justify any disparity. We need to analyze each case, understand whether these disparities come from current discriminatory laws or a lack of opportunities. I support policies that encourage economic and educational growth for vulnerable groups. But I believe that doing so exclusively through a racial or gender lens doesn't always solve the core of the problem, Diane insisted. So you don't see the need for reparations, for example? Ben frowned. General reparations can do more harm than good. There are more efficient ways to invest in the community, such as improving schools, strengthening small businesses in poor neighborhoods, or mentoring programs. We need to create opportunities, not generic checks that create divisions. The exchange of barbs was intense, but until that moment, Ben remained calm. In the studio, however, tempers began to flare. Anyone watching could see that neither side was going to give in easily. Whoopi Goldberg, realizing that the atmosphere was getting heavy, tried to take the conversation to another point, but the debate had already turned into a duel. Emily Jenkins hit back. Ben, still on this woke agenda, you criticize everything related to gender awareness, inclusive education. Do you think there's no place for these agendas in a society that should be open to everyone? Ben nodded, as if he had the answer on the tip of his tongue. I don't criticize respect for diversity. What I do criticize is when they try to impose a specific ideology, like insisting that 6-year-olds should learn complex identity concepts without even knowing how to read and write properly. That's indoctrination, not education. At this point, the audience was divided between applause and booing. A few shouts of "out" and "let him speak" could be heard at the same time. Whoopi raised her hand, asking for calm. People, please, let's keep it civil. She turned to Ben. Perhaps we can find a compromise. Would you accept a gradual approach, teaching respect for differences in an age-appropriate way? Ben relaxed his shoulders a little. Of course, respect for others should be taught at home and at school. But respect is not the same as imposing a single worldview. Those who were following along in the studio and on social media could see that Ben had agile answers, and even with the panel pressing him, he didn't back down. What was missing was a move that would change the course of the program once and for all. And it was at that moment that Michael Parker, in his dressing room watching on the in-house TV, noticed something strange. A comment on Twitter was gaining popularity, accusing Ben of hypocrisy in an old case. The production team was whispering in the corridors. In real time, Messages arrived on the screens that Whoopi and the co-hosts had at their disposal. One of them looked at Emily, who whispered something in Whoopi's ear. "Ben, we've received some breaking news," said Whoopi, looking serious. "Someone on Twitter is saying that you colluded with educational segregation measures in your community in the past. Something to do with a bill to restrict minority enrollment in public schools. How do you respond to that?" The audience groaned in unison in surprise. Ben leaned forward, frowning. "That's a pretty serious accusation. Anyone who knows me knows that I've always stood up for merit and equal opportunities. Perhaps you could shed some light on this supposed support." Emily shot back, eyes twinkling. "There seems to be evidence that you signed a petition in favor of a law that restricted students by zoning and that largely impacted Black and Latino children." Ben took a deep breath, already noticing the disapproving looks coming from the audience. "Yes, there was a petition in my neighborhood a few years ago about increasing school places, but it wasn't about excluding minorities. It was about infrastructure. The schools were overcrowded, unable to accommodate more pupils. I didn't know that this would be interpreted as a form of segregation." Diane Miller, merciless, practically jumped on Ben. "Didn't you know or didn't you care?" The studio boiled over. The tension was palpable. For a moment, it seemed as if Ben Shapiro had been cornered. Some spectators began to boo, while others clapped, waiting for his response. Michael Parker, backstage, was trying to contact someone by phone to obtain documents that would clarify the issue. Whoopi Goldberg's team seemed satisfied, getting a taste of a bombastic moment against the conservative guest. However, to everyone's surprise, a voice echoed from the side of the stage. It was Richard Barnes, a former public school principal from New York, who was there for a quick appearance on another panel. Impromptu, he asked for the microphone. "Sorry, Whoopi, I don't usually interrupt, but this is important. I was in charge of school management at the time this petition was launched. I can attest that Ben Shapiro sought information about overcrowding before signing anything. The district was really suffering from serious structural problems that were hurting all the students." The audience fell silent. The presenters exchanged confused glances. Who would have thought that a former principal, reputed to be a Democrat and sympathetic to progressive policies, would show up to defend Ben Shapiro right there, live? Ben blinked, surprised. "Richard, thanks for clarifying. I had no idea. You were here." Richard shook his head, turning to Whoopi. "I'm not saying I agree with all of Ben's opinions, but this accusation is unfair. The idea of the petition was not to prevent minorities from entering, but to pressure the district to allocate more money to expand schools. Unfortunately, some people interpreted it differently and used it as a political weapon." The audience was stunned. The presenters didn't know how to react. Anyone expecting to see Ben devastated by the accusation was now faced with a turnaround, supported by someone with no ties to him. Ben breathed a sigh of relief, but remained firm. "I appreciate that, Richard, and I reaffirm my usual position. I'm against any form of exclusion or segregation. I'm in favor of solving structural problems, not creating racial conflicts." Some applause could be heard in the audience. Emily and Diane looked at each other, not knowing how to continue. Whoopi, more experienced, tried to regain control of the program. With time running out, there were only a few minutes of transmission left. Whoopi Goldberg's expression said it all. What should have been a moment of embarrassment for Ben Shapiro turned into a scene that strengthened him in front of the cameras. There were still intense disagreements, but the blow they had hoped to strike against him had just dissipated in the face of unexpected testimony. Whoopi sniffled and took back the microphone. "Well, I think we all agree on something here. There's a lot to be discussed about education policies. Maybe it's not all about accusations of segregation or indoctrination. Ben, would you like to leave a final message for our viewers?" Ben inclined his head in a gesture of respect. "Of course. I wanted to say that although I don't agree with many of the positions on this show, I believe we need frank and open debates. Our country was built on freedom of expression and the constant search for solutions for everyone. I hope we can always discuss, disagree, and reach some common ground without labeling the other as an enemy." The audience reacted with mixed applause. The director signaled that there were 10 seconds to go. The camera moved closer to Whoopi, who concluded, "Thank you for coming, Ben. Whether you agree or not, this is a space for dialogue, and you've shown that you can defend your ideas firmly." And then the program went off the air, ending the broadcast in a tense and, at the same time, surprised mood. After all, the strongest attack against Ben had been diffused live. The studio was filled with murmurs as soon as the red camera lights went out. Whoopi chatted with the production team, while Emily and Diane walked away, visibly annoyed. Michael Parker approached Ben, smiling. "I never thought I'd see someone defend you live in a situation like that. That was quite a turnaround." Ben shook his head. "I didn't expect it either. I guess the truth has strange ways of coming out." Richard Barnes approached, visibly relieved. "I'm sorry if I stole your moment to respond, but I thought it was unfair of them to leave you in the lurch without telling you the facts." Ben shook his hand gratefully. "You have no idea how much that clarified things." Meanwhile, in a corner of the corridor, Emily Jenkins was commenting to producer Sarah Donovan. "I was sure it would be the end for him. Who would have thought that this director would show up just in time?" Sarah, who had initially invited Ben, shrugged. "That's the risk of doing a live show, Emily. You never know who might come up with another version of the story." Shortly afterwards, Ben walked out into the corridors, being stared at sometimes with disapproval, sometimes with respect. He was used to the attention, but now there was a different component, the feeling that, even in hostile terrain, sometimes the truth prevails. On social media, excerpts of the clash went viral. Conservative comments praised Ben Shapiro for calmly confronting the hosts of The View. Some progressives said that he had manipulated the speech, but they couldn't deny the former director's speech, which reinforced his version. In the days that followed, the internet discussed the case intensely. "Ben Shapiro humiliates The View panel with facts and logic" was the most common headline on conservative portals. Meanwhile, in certain more left-wing circles, criticism of Ben's, in quotes, self-promoting show circulated. Whoopi Goldberg, in an appearance the day after, mentioned that the show had been marked by strong disagreements, but also a demonstration that sometimes appearances can be deceiving. He didn't give details, but acknowledged that the production could have been based on accusations that had not been fully verified. Ben, for his part, kept a low profile, without claiming victory. On his podcast, he limited himself to commenting, "Nobody wins alone when there is dialogue. It's the public that benefits from having access to different views." Even so, his listeners celebrated what they saw as a triumph against the progressive media. A few days later, Ben received an email from a woman named Brenda Carter, a Chicago resident who introduced herself as a mother of 3 and a fan of The View. She wrote, "Ben, I don't agree with almost anything you say, but I was impressed by your calmness in the interview. My kids watched the show, and we talked about the importance of listening to those who think differently. I think we all learned something. Thank you for showing us that it's possible to disagree without being insulting." The message touched him. Amid the daily attacks and polarization, there were people who wanted dialogue. People who might never vote like him, but valued honest conversation. He then recalled his stance that day, firm but not aggressive. In his usual fiery speeches, he used to be more ironic, but perhaps the live context made him react in a more measured way. The fact that he had been saved by someone outside his circle, Richard Barnes, had also made him reflect on the complexity of real life, far beyond easy labeling. At the end of the week, another unusual invitation came along. A progressive university group in Boston wanted Ben to give a talk on how identity politics might or might not affect freedom of expression on campuses. It was another opportunity for dialogue, perhaps even more risky than his appearance on The View. Michael Parker, his advisor, spoke up. "Ben, are you really going to accept? They might try to boo you or ban your speech." Ben shrugged. "If I don't go, I'll be doing exactly what I criticize in others, running away from those who disagree with me. I'll accept it, and we'll see how it goes." A few days later, he received an email from Richard Barnes saying he was happy to have helped. He invited Ben to visit a tutoring project for underprivileged students in New York. Ben thought for a moment before replying that he was interested in learning about practical actions that could unite rather than divide. Gradually, the political tension that always hung over his speeches was now given a layer of humanity. Ben Shapiro's appearance on The View became a symbol of how a debate can take unpredictable turns. He, who had been asked to be pressured, ended up surprising not only with his solid arguments, but also with the sincerity of someone who recognized him as a legitimate part of a solution, not a problem. Despite the visceral disagreements, the episode left a legacy. While Whoopi Goldberg kept a show that generally echoed more progressive views, for a brief moment, conservative audiences felt there was room for their voices to be heard. And progressive viewers were faced with the need to check sources and understand that not all supposed evidence against a political opponent is necessarily true. The final message? Often, the greatest revelations come when we are willing to listen, or when someone unexpected decides to speak up. The truth can come from the most unlikely place, and the courage to expose oneself to contradiction is what makes ideas grow or fall apart. In the end, the main lesson lies in values that should be universal, regardless of political affiliation: compassion, empathy, and respect. Respect for the history of others. Empathy to understand the reasons behind each argument, and compassion to admit that, faced with the complexities of the world, no one has all the answers alone. In a country marked by deep divisions, this episode showed that conversation, however tough, is still the way to possible understanding, and that ultimately we all want a place where we can prosper without having to humiliate or destroy those who think differently. At a time when the endurance of old values is being questioned, Ben Shapiro's journey on stage reminded the audience that the value of ideas survives when they are supported by facts, good faith, and the search for genuine solutions to real problems. And above all, that you don't have to agree with everything to respect someone. You just have to recognize that behind every opinion, there is a human being with stories and motivations that deserve to be heard. And so, as these curtains close, it becomes clear: the battle between worldviews can be fierce, but overcoming differences only happens with courage, dialogue, and surprisingly, a dose of humility.